It was a bitter, cold December night in Riverside Grove when Tom Wilson's life changed forever. The kind of night where frost creeps across window panes and even the streetlights seem to shiver in the wind. At Anderson's Auto Repair, Tom sat hunched over an old Chevy's engine, his weathered hands working methodically despite the late hour. He'd promised Mrs. Chen from the local diner he'd have her delivery van ready by morning, and Tom Wilson never broke a promise. The ancient wall clock read 10:45 p.m. when he heard it, a faint tapping at the shop's front door, barely audible over the howling wind. Tom wasn't expecting anyone. Most folks in Riverside Grove knew his official hours ended at 6. But something about that gentle knock made him pause. Wiping his hands on his oil-stained rag, Tom made his way through the dimly lit shop. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a hunched figure, seemingly swaying in the bitter wind. When he opened the door, his heart nearly stopped. There stood Margaret Maggie Sullivan, one of the town's most beloved retired teachers, looking nothing like her usual put-together self. Her silver hair was windswept, her face pale as the snow falling around her. She wasn't wearing a proper winter coat, just a thin cardigan that offered little protection against the brutal cold. "Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling, I didn't know where else to go. My car. It's stuck up on Miller's Ridge. I tried calling for help, but my phone." She held up her phone with shaking hands, its screen dark and lifeless. Tom's protective instincts kicked in immediately. Miller's Ridge was treacherous on a good day, let alone during a winter storm. What was Maggie doing up there alone at this hour? But he knew questions could wait. Right now, she needed help. "Come inside, Mrs. Sullivan," Tom said firmly, guiding her toward the small office where he kept an electric heater running. As she sank into his worn leather chair, he noticed her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. How long had she been out in the cold? "I'll make you some coffee," Tom said, already reaching for the ancient coffee maker he kept for late nights. "Then you can tell me exactly what happened." As the coffee brewed, Maggie's story came out in fragments. She'd been driving back from visiting her sick sister in the neighboring town. The storm had picked up suddenly, as winter storms often did in this part of the country. She'd taken Miller's Ridge thinking it would be a shorter route home, but her car had skidded on a patch of black ice, ending up half buried in a snowbank. "I tried walking," she admitted, clutching the warm coffee cup Tom had pressed into her hands. "I thought I could make it to town, but everything started looking the same in the snow. If I hadn't seen your shop's light." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Miller's Ridge was 5 miles from town. If Maggie had been wandering in this weather, he didn't want to think about how this night could have ended. "Stay here," he said, already reaching for his heavy winter coat and emergency kit. "I'm going to get your car." "Oh, Tom, no," Maggie protested weakly. "It's too dangerous. We can wait until morning." But Tom was already checking his tow truck's chains. "Mrs. Sullivan, you were my favorite teacher in 8th grade. You never gave up on me, even when I couldn't understand algebra. Now it's my turn not to give up on you." The next hour was a battle against nature itself. Tom's tow truck crept up Miller's Ridge, its headlights barely penetrating the swirling snow. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he kept thinking of Maggie, of how she'd walked miles in this bitter cold, of how close this night had come to ending in tragedy. He found her car exactly where she'd described, its blue paint barely visible under the snow. Getting it hooked up to the tow truck was grueling work. His fingers went numb despite his thick gloves, and the wind cut through his coat like it was made of paper. But Tom didn't quit. That wasn't who he was. Back at the shop, he found Maggie had fallen asleep in the office chair, wrapped in the emergency blanket he kept for cold nights. The sight made his chest tight. This woman who had shaped so many Young minds who had given 40 years of her life to teaching Riverside Grove's children had nearly become another tragic headline. As he worked to get her car ready for the short drive to her house, Tom thought about how life's most important moments often come disguised as inconveniences. If he hadn't stayed late to finish Mrs. Chen's van, if he hadn't heard that quiet knock, if his shop light hadn't been visible through the storm. What happened next would become the talk of Riverside Grove for years to come, though Tom Wilson didn't know it yet. After ensuring Maggie Sullivan made it safely home that night, he'd returned to his shop, finished Mrs. Chen's van as promised, and fallen into bed as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of winter grey. 3 days passed in the usual rhythm of small-town life. Tom fixed transmissions, changed oil, and helped old Mr. Cooper get his ancient Ford pickup running again. He barely thought about that stormy night, except to wave at Maggie when she drove past the shop in her now repaired car. That's just what neighbors did for each other in Riverside Grove. They helped without expecting anything in return. But on the fourth morning, as Tom was unlocking the shop's front door, a sleek black SUV pulled into his gravel parking lot. The kind of vehicle he rarely saw in these parts, with tinted windows and government plates. His first thought was that something must be wrong. Maybe someone had reported him for staying open too late, though that seemed unlikely in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. 2 people stepped out of the SUV. The first was Maggie Sullivan, but not as he'd ever seen her before. Gone was the retired teacher in sensible shoes. Instead, she stood tall in an elegant wool coat, her silver hair perfectly styled. Behind her came a man in a crisp suit who looked distinctly out of place among Tom's rusty tools and oil stains. "Tom," Maggie called out warmly, "I hope we're not interrupting your morning." "Never too busy for you, Mrs. Sullivan," Tom replied, though his eyes kept drifting to the stranger. "Is everything all right with the car?" The man in the suit stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Wilson, I'm James Harrison, Director of the National Highway Safety Administration's Regional Office. Mrs. Sullivan here has told me quite a story about you." Tom shook the offered hand automatically, his mind racing. The National Highway Safety Administration in his small-town shop. "Please," Maggie said, "could we step inside? What we have to discuss shouldn't be done standing in the cold." Inside his small office, Tom cleared off the 2 rickety chairs he kept for customers, acutely aware of the coffee stains on his desk and the ancient calendar still showing last month's page. James Harrison didn't seem to notice the humble surroundings as he opened his briefcase. "Mr. Wilson," Harrison began, "what you did the other night, going out in that storm to rescue Mrs. Sullivan, it probably seemed like just another act of kindness to you, but do you know what the temperature was that night?" Tom shook his head. "-15 degrees with the wind chill," Harrison continued. "The storm had closed 3 major highways. We had 7 weather-related fatalities in the region that night. Mrs. Sullivan would likely have been the 8th, if not for you." The gravity of that statement hung in the air. Tom had known the situation was serious, but hearing it laid out so starkly made his throat tight. "But that's not why we're here," Maggie interjected, her eyes twinkling with something that reminded Tom of his school days. "Tom, there's something I never told you, or anyone in town really. Before I was a teacher, I worked for the Department of Transportation, and even after retirement, I've continued to serve on several federal transportation safety boards." She paused, letting that sink in. "The night you helped me, I wasn't just driving back from visiting my sister. I was returning from a conference about rural highway safety, particularly focusing on emergency response in remote areas during extreme weather conditions." Harrison nodded, pulling out some papers. "Mr. Wilson, what you did that night, it wasn't just about saving Mrs. Sullivan. You demonstrated exactly the kind of local emergency response system we've been trying to develop. A lit shop visible from the road, emergency supplies on hand, the knowledge and capability to perform difficult rescues in extreme conditions. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I just did what anyone would do. But that's just it, Maggie said softly. Not anyone could have done what you did. You had the skills, the equipment, and most importantly, the heart to help someone in need without hesitation. Harrison laid the papers on Tom's desk. We want to launch a pilot program, Mr. Wilson. A network of certified emergency response stations along rural highways, operated by skilled mechanics who can provide both technical assistance and emergency aid. We want to start here, in Riverside Grove, and we want you to help us design and implement it. Tom stared at the papers, his coffee growing cold beside them. Me? But I'm just a small-town mechanic. You're exactly who we need, Harrison insisted. Someone who understands both the technical and human aspects of emergency response. Someone who knows what it's like to be the only help available on a cold night when everything goes wrong.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The proposal laid out before him was more than Tom could have imagined. A substantial grant to upgrade his shop with emergency equipment, training programs he would help develop for other mechanics, a chance to create something that could save lives across the country. Of course, Maggie added with a gentle smile, you'll keep running your regular repair shop too. We know how much this community needs you, but you'll also be part of something bigger, something that could help prevent tragedies on nights like the one we shared. The transformation of Anderson's auto repair happened gradually over the next few months, but to Tom Wilson, each change felt like stepping into a dream. The old shop he'd inherited from his father began to take on a new life, though he made sure to keep the heart of it intact. The worn wooden workbench where he'd learned to rebuild engines, the coffee maker that had comforted countless stranded travelers, and most importantly, the warm, welcoming atmosphere that had made it a sanctuary on cold nights. The government grant brought state-of-the-art emergency equipment, all-weather rescue gear, advanced first aid stations, and a new tow truck specially designed for extreme conditions. But more than the equipment, it was the responsibility that weighed on Tom's shoulders. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore. He was creating a blueprint that could save lives across the country. One crisp morning in March, as Tom was installing new emergency lights on the shop's exterior, a familiar voice called out from the street. Looking good, Mr. Wilson. It was Danny Cooper, one of his former students from the automotive classes he taught at the local high school. The boy, now a young man, had grown into a skilled mechanic himself, running his own shop 2 towns over. Danny, Tom called back, climbing down from his ladder, what brings you to this side of the county? The young mechanic's eyes were bright with purpose. I heard about what you're doing here, Mr. Wilson. The emergency response program. Word's getting around. I want in. That conversation would prove to be another turning point. Danny became the first mechanic to join what they now called the Safe Harbor Network, a growing chain of emergency-ready repair shops along rural highways. His enthusiasm and fresh perspective brought new energy to the program, and soon, other mechanics from neighboring towns began reaching out. But it wasn't until a stormy night in late April that Tom truly understood the impact of what they were building. The emergency alert system they'd installed lit up at 2 a.m. A family of 4 stranded on Highway 23, their minivan caught in flash flooding. Tom and Danny, who'd been working late on documentation for the program, sprang into action. What they found at the scene would have been impossible to handle in the old days. But with their new equipment, specialized training, and coordinated effort between 2 safe harbor stations, they managed to rescue the family and their vehicle before the rising waters could claim either. The father, holding his shivering children, close in Tom's warm shop afterward looked at him with tears in his eyes. "We didn't think anyone would come, not in this weather, not out here." "That's why we're here," Tom replied simply, handing out hot chocolate to the kids, "so no one has to face these situations alone anymore." The story made the local news, then regional, and finally caught the attention of national media. Suddenly, Tom's quiet shop was flooded with reporters wanting to know about the rural mechanic who was revolutionizing emergency response systems. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. One morning, as Tom was demonstrating emergency protocols to a new group of mechanics joining the network, a sleek helicopter landed in the field behind his shop. Out stepped James Harrison, accompanied by a group of officials from various federal agencies. "Tom," Harrison called out, beaming, "you've done something extraordinary here. What started as a pilot program has become a model for rural safety infrastructure. We've got requests from 17 states wanting to implement your safe harbor network." The officials spent the day touring the facility, now a fully operational emergency response center, while still maintaining its character as a local repair shop. They watched as Tom and Danny demonstrated the protocols they'd developed, showing how traditional mechanical knowledge could be adapted for emergency situations. But the moment that stuck with Tom came later that evening. After the officials had left, Maggie Sullivan appeared at his door, just as she had on that fateful winter night. This time, though, she wasn't seeking help. She was bringing something. "I found this in my attic," she said, holding out a faded photograph. "I thought you should have it." The picture showed a much younger Tom, maybe 17, working on an engine while his father watched proudly. It had been taken right in this shop, probably during one of the many nights they'd stayed late to help stranded travelers. "Your father understood what you're teaching all these mechanics now," Maggie said softly. "That it's not just about fixing cars, it's about being there for people when they need you most." Tom looked around his shop, at the new equipment sitting alongside his father's old tools, at the maps showing the growing network of safe harbor stations, at the young mechanics eagerly learning to be not just repairmen, but lifelines for their communities. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "This is just the beginning." And he was right. The Safe Harbor Network would go on to save hundreds of lives over the next few years, transforming the way rural communities handled emergencies. But more than that, it changed how people saw small-town mechanics, not just as fixers of broken vehicles, but as guardians of their communities, keeping their lights on through the darkest nights. 1 year after that stormy night on Miller's Ridge, Tom Wilson stood before a packed auditorium in Washington, D.C. The crowd was filled with mechanics, first responders, and government officials from across the country, all gathered for the first National Safe Harbor Network Conference. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he couldn't help but think about how far a simple act of kindness had rippled. "A year ago," Tom began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I was just a small-town mechanic who kept his shop light on late at night. Today, there are over 200 safe harbor stations across America, each one a beacon of hope for travelers in need. But this isn't my story. It's our story. It's the story of every mechanic who's ever stayed late because someone might need help. Every shop owner who's turned their garage into a sanctuary on a cold night." In the front row, Maggie Sullivan smiled proudly, sitting next to James Harrison, and representatives from 30 state transportation departments. But Tom's eyes were drawn to the familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Danny Cooper and other mechanics from neighboring towns, each now running their own safe harbor stations. "Last month alone," Tom continued, "our network helped over 3,000 stranded travelers. We prevented what could have been 47 serious accidents. We provided emergency assistance in 73 severe weather situations. But numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is about the people. He clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph that had become famous in their community. The Johnson family, the ones they'd rescued from the flash flood, standing in front of their local safe harbor station with Tom and Danny. The Johnsons were traveling to see their dying grandmother. If they hadn't made it that night, 3 children would never have had the chance to say goodbye. That's what this network is about. Not just saving lives, but protecting moments that matter. After the presentation, as people mingled during the reception, Tom found himself approached by a young woman in a wheelchair. Her name was Sarah Martinez, and she had driven from California to share her story. 6 months ago, she told him, my car broke down in the Mojave Desert. It was midnight, no cell service, and my medication was running low. I have a rare condition that requires regular injections. She smiled, touching the safe harbor pin on Tom's lapel. One of your stations found me. The mechanic didn't just fix my car. He knew exactly what to do medically until help arrived. Your protocols saved my life. Stories like Sarah's had become increasingly common. The safe harbor network had evolved beyond its original scope, becoming a crucial part of America's rural safety infrastructure. Each station was now equipped not just for mechanical emergencies, but for medical crises, severe weather events, and even natural disasters. Back in Riverside Grove, Tom's original shop had become something of a legend. Tourists would stop by, just to see where it all started. But they'd find something more meaningful than a historical landmark. They'd find a working shop that still helped every person who walked through its doors. One quiet evening, as Tom was training a new group of mechanics in emergency protocols, a familiar black SUV pulled up outside. James Harrison stepped out, but this time he wasn't alone. With him was the Secretary of Transportation. "Tom," Harrison said, barely containing his excitement, "we've got some news. Congress just approved the Rural Emergency Response Act. They're calling it the Safe Harbor Bill informally. Full federal funding for emergency response stations across every rural highway in America." The secretary stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Wilson, we want you to head the National Implementation Team. Your network has proven that local mechanics can be the backbone of rural emergency response. Now it's time to take it nationwide." Tom looked around his shop, at his father's, old tools hanging on the wall, at the state-of-the-art emergency equipment, at the young mechanics eagerly absorbing every lesson he could teach. He thought about that cold night, when Maggie Sullivan knocked on his door, how close they'd come to tragedy, and how that moment had sparked something far bigger than himself. "On one condition," he said to the secretary, "the program stays true to its roots. We're not building a bureaucracy, we're building a community. Every station keeps its local character. Every mechanic knows their community's needs. We're not just creating emergency stations. We're preserving the heart of small-town America." The secretary smiled. "That's exactly why we need you to lead this, Mr. Wilson." As they worked out the details, Tom received a text from Danny Cooper. Another safe harbor station had just opened in Montana, run by a former student from their training program. Attached was a photo of the shop's light glowing in the darkness, a beacon for anyone in need. Today, the Safe Harbor Network stands as a testament to the power of small acts of kindness. What began with one mechanic helping one stranded teacher has grown into a nationwide movement that saves thousands of lives each year. But in Riverside Grove, Tom Wilson still keeps his shop light on late at night, still fixes Mrs. Chen's delivery van, and still believes that the greatest change starts with the smallest acts of compassion. Because in the end, being a hero isn't about grand gestures or national recognition. It's about being there when someone needs you, about keeping your light on in the darkness, about believing that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change the world. 5 years after the inception of the Safe Harbor Network, Tom Wilson's vision had grown beyond anything he could have imagined that stormy night. On a crisp autumn morning, he stood beside Maggie Sullivan at the opening of the Safe Harbor Training Academy, a state-of-the-art facility built on the outskirts of Riverside Grove. "Did you ever think," Maggie asked, her eyes twinkling, "that helping a stranded teacher would lead to all this?" The academy was a testament to how far they'd come, a sprawling campus dedicated to training the next generation of emergency response mechanics, complete with simulation rooms, weather laboratories, and a fleet of vehicles modified for every possible scenario. But what made Tom most proud wasn't the building, it was the people inside it. "Today's incoming class has 300 students," Tom said, watching young mechanics file into the main hall. "From every state in the country, plus 2 from Canada. They're not just learning to fix cars anymore, they're learning to save lives." The academy had become the heart of the Safe Harbor Network's evolution. Here, mechanics learned more than traditional auto repair. They studied emergency, medicine, weather patterns, crisis management, and community leadership. It was a new kind of first responder training, one that recognized the crucial role that rural mechanics played in America's safety infrastructure. Among the new students was Maria Rodriguez, a third-generation mechanic from Texas. Her story particularly touched Tom. Her grandfather had been saved by a safe harbor station during a severe dust storm the previous year. Now she was here to ensure other families would have the same chance. "Mr. Wilson," Maria said, approaching him after the opening ceremony, "my grandfather told me to give you this." She handed him a weathered wrench, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. He said it helped him keep his shop running for 40 years. He wanted it to be part of something bigger. Tom added the wrench to the Academy's wall of service, a growing collection of tools donated by mechanics across the country, each with its own story of helping others. The wall had become a powerful symbol of their community's heritage and future, but the Safe Harbor Network's impact went far beyond mechanical training. The program had sparked a renaissance in rural communities across America. Small towns that had been losing their young people to big cities were seeing a revival as the prestige and purpose of running a safe harbor station drew a new generation back home. In Millbrook, 60 miles from Riverside Grove, former bartender turned mechanic Steve Patterson had transformed his grandfather's abandoned gas station into a safe harbor facility. The station had become a community hub, hosting safety workshops for local schools and emergency preparedness classes for residents. Before Safe Harbor, Steve explained during a training session at the academy, people saw small-town mechanics as a dying breed. Now they see us as essential community leaders. We're not just fixing vehicles, we're building stronger communities. The network's success had caught international attention. Delegations from Europe, Asia, and Australia had visited the academy, studying the model for implementation in their own rural areas. Tom often thought about how his father would have reacted to seeing their small family shop inspire a global movement. One rainy afternoon, as Tom was reviewing emergency protocols with a group of international observers, Danny Cooper burst into his office, his face lit with excitement. "Tom, you need to see this." He pulled up a live video feed on the main screen. A safe harbor station in Alaska was coordinating a massive rescue operation during a sudden blizzard. 27 stranded vehicles, over 60 people at risk, and the network was responding like a well-oiled machine. They watched as stations across the region activated, sharing real-time weather data, dispatching equipment, and coordinating with emergency services. By nightfall, every stranded traveler was safe, warm, and being cared for at various safe harbor locations. "This," Tom said to the observers, "is what we built." Not just a network of mechanics, but a community that looks out for each other, no matter the distance, no matter the challenge. The Safe Harbor Network had also begun to influence policy at the national level. The Rural Emergency Response Act had been expanded, with new provisions for climate resilience and community emergency preparedness. Tom had testified before Congress multiple times, sharing stories of lives saved and communities strengthened. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was visible in the smaller moments. Like when Tom received a letter from a young girl in Idaho, whose mother had found refuge at a safe harbor station during a dangerous storm. The girl had drawn a picture of the station, its light glowing in the darkness with the words, "Thank you for keeping my mommy safe," written in crayon. Or when Maggie Sullivan, now in her late 70s, still volunteered at the academy, sharing her story with each new class of trainees. "Remember," she would tell them, "every person who walks through your door is someone's loved one. Treat them like family." The Safe Harbor Network had grown to over 500 stations across North America, each one maintaining its unique local character while being part of something larger. The original vision of keeping a light on for those in need had never been lost. One evening, as Tom was locking up the academy, he found Maria Rodriguez still working in the simulation lab, practicing emergency procedures long after her classmates had left. "You know," he said, "your grandfather's wrench has inspired a lot of people on that wall." Maria smiled, wiping grease from her hands. "He always said that tools are just tools. It's the heart behind them that matters. That's what Safe Harbor taught us, isn't it? That being a mechanic is about more than fixing what's broken. It's about keeping people whole." As Tom drove home that night, past the warm glow of his old shop, now a working museum and still serving the community, he thought about all the lights burning in safe harbor stations across the country. Each one a beacon of hope, each one a testament to the power of simple kindness. 10 years had passed since that fateful night on Miller's Ridge, and the Safe Harbor Network had become more than just a safety system. It had evolved into a way of life. On this particular morning, Tom Wilson wasn't in his shop or at the academy. Instead, he was standing in the rose garden of the White House, about to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The journey from small-town mechanic to national hero hadn't changed Tom's humble nature. He still wore his work boots, even with the suit Maggie Sullivan had insisted he buy for the occasion. His calloused hands, marked by years of honest work, held the speech he'd written on the back of a repair invoice. "A decade ago," the president began, addressing the gathered crowd, "a mechanic in a small town kept his shop light on during a storm. Today, that light has become a symbol of hope across our nation. The Safe Harbor Network has saved over 100,000 lives, transformed rural emergency response, and reminded us all what it means to be a community." As Tom stepped forward to receive the medal, he caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. Danny Cooper, now the Executive Director of Safe Harbor Operations; Maria Rodriguez, who had graduated from the academy and gone on to establish a groundbreaking mobile emergency response unit in the Southwest. And there, in the front row, Maggie Sullivan, her eyes glistening with pride. But the ceremony at the White House wasn't the real story of Safe Harbor's success. The real story was playing out in thousands of communities across the country. Take Sarah Chen, for example. She ran a safe harbor station in rural Oregon that had become famous for its innovative approach to mountain rescue operations. Her station had developed a network of emergency caches along treacherous mountain roads, each stocked with supplies and equipped with solar-powered emergency beacons. "We learned from Tom," Sarah explained during a network conference, "that being prepared isn't just about having the right equipment, it's about understanding your community's unique challenges." The Safe Harbor Network had also sparked an unexpected renaissance in vocational education. High schools across the country had started incorporating Safe Harbor certification into their automotive programs, creating a new generation of mechanics who saw their profession as a calling rather than just a job. In Riverside Grove, Tom's original shop had become something of a pilgrimage site. Young mechanics would travel from across the country to touch the old workbench where it all began, to see the spot where Maggie had knocked on that stormy night. But Tom had insisted that the shop remain a working Safe Harbor station, not just a museum. The best way to honor our history, he often said, is to keep helping people. One morning, as Tom was conducting a training session at the academy, an alert came through the emergency network. A massive winter storm was bearing down on the Midwest, threatening to strand hundreds of travelers. What happened next demonstrated just how far they'd come. Within minutes, Safe Harbor stations across 6 states activated their emergency protocols. Real-time weather data flowed through the network, allowing stations to predict where help would be needed most. Mobile response units were deployed to strategic locations. Local communities opened their doors, turning Safe Harbor stations into temporary shelters. "This is what we built," Tom told his students as they watched the operation unfold. "Not just a rescue network, but a community that takes care of its own." The impact of Safe Harbor had reached far beyond emergency response. The network had become a model for rural development, showing how small towns could remain vital and relevant in a changing world. Local economies had grown around Safe Harbor stations. Young people were returning to their hometowns, drawn by the opportunity to be part of something meaningful. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people saw themselves and their neighbors. The Safe Harbor spirit of helping others had spread far beyond the network itself. In a small town in Kansas, a group of high school students had started a junior Safe Harbor program, helping elderly neighbors prepare their homes for severe weather. In Montana, ranchers had organized a volunteer network inspired by Safe Harbor principles, helping each other during harsh winters. What Tom Wilson started, Maggie Sullivan told a reporter, wasn't just about emergency response. It was about reminding us who we are as people, that we're strongest when we look out for each other. The network had also begun to address broader challenges. Climate change had made extreme weather more common, and Safe Harbor stations had become critical hubs for climate resilience. The Academy now offered courses in sustainable emergency response, teaching mechanics how to operate with minimal environmental impact, even during crises. One evening, as Tom was reviewing plans for the network's expansion into Canada, he received a visitor at his old shop. It was the son of the Johnson family, the ones they'd rescued from the flash flood years ago. Now a young man, he'd just completed his Safe Harbor certification. "I never forgot what you did for my family," he said, holding out his certification badge. "I wanted to be able to do the same for others." That night, as Tom locked up his shop, he looked up at the light that had started it all. It still burned bright, a beacon in the darkness, just as thousands of other lights now burned at Safe Harbor stations across the country. The Safe Harbor network had become more than Tom Wilson could have ever imagined on that stormy night 10 years ago. But its heart remained the same, one light burning in the darkness, one person helping another, one community coming together to ensure that no one faces life's storms alone. The 15th anniversary of the Safe Harbor network brought an unexpected challenge that would test everything they had built. A massive cyber attack targeted America's critical infrastructure, leaving much of the country's emergency response systems vulnerable. But in this moment of crisis, the simple community-based approach that Tom Wilson had championed proved to be more resilient than anyone could have imagined. "We've always kept one foot in the old world," Tom explained to a room full of government officials gathered at the academy. Every safe harbor station can operate completely off-grid. We never abandoned the basics: paper maps, mechanical, tools, human knowledge. Sometimes the old ways are the most reliable. While modern emergency systems struggled to cope, the safe harbor network became the backbone of rural emergency response. Stations across the country fell back on their traditional methods: radio communications, local knowledge, and the trust they'd built within their communities. In the command center of the academy, Tom watched as Danny Cooper coordinated the network's response. Red dots on a large wall map showed safe harbor stations operating at full capacity, their lights still burning bright despite the digital darkness. "This is why we train the way we do," Danny said, marking another active station on the map. "Every mechanic in our network knows how to work without computers. Every station can function as an independent unit. We're not just a network of machines. We're a network of people." The crisis brought out the best in the safe harbor community. Maria Rodriguez, now running 3 stations in Texas, had organized a convoy of mobile repair units that traveled between rural communities, ensuring no one was left isolated. Her teams carried not just tools and spare parts, but also essential supplies and medicine. "We're seeing the real strength of the safe harbor model," Maggie Sullivan observed, watching the operation unfold. Though retired from active involvement, she still served as the network's elder stateswoman. "It's not about technology. It's about trust, community, and human connection." The national media descended on Riverside Grove, amazed by how this rural network was keeping America moving while more sophisticated systems failed. Tom's old shop, still operational after all these years, became a symbol of resilience. Sarah Chen, running her mountain station in Oregon, had implemented an innovative solution. She'd revived an old system of signal fires, updated with safe harbor protocols, to communicate between isolated communities. "Sometimes the oldest solutions are the best ones," she explained via radio. "We're using methods that worked hundreds of years ago, just adapted for today's needs." But the real story wasn't about the network's ability to handle a crisis. It was about how the safe harbor philosophy had prepared communities for any challenge. In small towns across America, people weren't panicking about the technology, failure. Instead, they were coming together, helping each other, just as they'd learned to do through years of safe harbor influence. In Idaho, a group of ranchers organized a horseback messenger service between safe harbor stations, ensuring communication continued even without phones or internet. In Michigan, local fishing boats formed a water-based emergency response network, coordinating with safe harbor stations along the Great Lakes. At the academy, Tom had gathered the current class of trainees. "This," he told them, gesturing to the organized chaos around them, "is why we emphasize human skills above all else. Technology can fail, but community never does." The crisis lasted for 3 weeks, and when it was over, the Safe Harbor Network had earned a new level of respect. Government agencies began studying their methods, recognizing that in an increasingly vulnerable world, there was immense value in systems that could operate on human power alone. One evening, as the situation was finally returning to normal, Tom received a special visitor at his shop. It was an elderly man he didn't recognize, but the man knew him. "15 years ago," the visitor said, "your network saved my daughter's life during a blizzard in Montana. Today I watched as you helped save our whole country from grinding to a halt. I had to come say thank you in person." The man turned out to be a retired engineer who had worked on some of the very systems that had failed during the crisis. "We always thought more technology was the answer," he admitted. "But you proved that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful." This crisis had taught them all something important. While the rest of the world had become increasingly dependent on complex systems, Safe Harbor had maintained a balance between progress and tradition. They'd never lost sight of the fundamental truth that had started it all, that at its core, emergency response was about people helping people. The experience led to a new initiative within the network. Tom called it the Basics Program, ensuring that every Safe Harbor station maintained the ability to operate completely offline. They began documenting traditional knowledge and skills, creating manuals that didn't require computers to be useful. "We're not against technology," Tom explained at a network meeting. "We just understand that it should support human connection, not replace it." As the sun set on another busy day at the academy, Tom stood with Maggie, watching the students practice emergency protocols without any electronic aids. They were using maps, compasses, and their own judgment, just as mechanics had done for generations. "You know what makes me proudest," Maggie said, her voice soft with emotion. "It's not that we survived this crisis. It's that we helped others survive it too." That's always been the heart of Safe Harbor, being there for others when they need us most. The cyber attack had proven something Tom had always believed, that the strength of any emergency response system lies not in its technology, but in its people. The Safe Harbor network hadn't just survived the crisis, it had shown a way forward, demonstrating how communities could remain resilient in an increasingly uncertain world. 20 years after that stormy night when Maggie Sullivan knocked on Tom Wilson's door, the Safe Harbor network faced its greatest evolutionary challenge yet. The world was changing rapidly, with new technologies and environmental challenges transforming the landscape of emergency response. But it was a tragedy close to home that would spark the network's next great innovation. The news reached Tom early one morning at the academy. Maggie Sullivan, the woman whose courage had started it all, had suffered a severe stroke while alone in her home. Despite living just 2 blocks from a Safe Harbor station, hours had passed before anyone found her. "We have this amazing network to help stranded travelers," Tom told the emergency meeting of Safe Harbor directors. "But what about the people right in our own communities? The ones who might be too proud or too independent to ask for help?" Danny Cooper, his hair now gray at the temples, was the first to respond. "What if we expanded our mission? Not just emergency response, but community care. This idea would become Safe Harbor Home, a program that would revolutionize how the network served its communities. Every Safe Harbor station began identifying vulnerable residents in their area. Elderly neighbors living alone, people with medical conditions, families with special needs, children. Maria Rodriguez, drawing from her experience with mobile response units, developed a system of regular check-ins that didn't feel intrusive. "It's not about monitoring people," she explained. "It's about being good neighbors." The program started small in Riverside Grove. Tom's original shop began offering free safety inspections for elderly residents' homes. They installed emergency pull buttons, but disguised them as ordinary objects to preserve dignity. Local high school students in the Junior Safe Harbor program would do regular wellness visits, disguised as casual social calls. "Miss Jenkins thinks I'm just coming by for her famous cookies," said Jimmy Parker, a 17-year-old volunteer. "But I'm actually making sure her heat is working and her walkway is clear of ice. It's what neighbors should do." As Maggie recovered in the hospital, the program spread rapidly across the network. Safe Harbor stations began partnering with local healthcare providers, creating a new kind of community safety net. They weren't just mechanics anymore. They were becoming community guardians. Sarah Chen's mountain station in Oregon took the concept further, developing a neighborhood pod system where small groups of households would look out for each other. In severe weather, Each pod has a designated safe harbor contact, she explained. No one falls through the cracks. The program revealed needs they hadn't anticipated. In rural Kansas, a safe harbor station discovered that many elderly residents were skipping medical appointments because they couldn't drive in bad weather. The station organized a volunteer transportation network using their mechanical expertise to maintain a fleet of donated vehicles. "We're still doing what we've always done," Tom explained to a new class of trainees, "using our skills to keep people safe. We've just expanded our definition of what that means." The impact was profound. Within 6 months, Safe Harbor Home had prevented countless emergencies before they happened. Blood pressure checks during routine home visits caught health issues early. Quick repairs prevented accidents. Regular contact reduced the isolation many rural elderly residents faced. One day, as Tom was reviewing program data at the academy, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Dr. Sarah Martinez, now the Surgeon General of the United States. "What you're doing here," she said, examining the Safe Harbor Home protocols, "could transform rural healthcare delivery. You've created a preventive care network that actually works." The medical community began studying the Safe Harbor model. Research showed that communities with active Safe Harbor Home programs had significantly lower rates of emergency hospital admissions among elderly residents. The network's combination of technical expertise, community trust, and regular presence made them uniquely effective at preventive care. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from Maggie Sullivan herself. 3 months after her stroke, she stood before a gathering of Safe Harbor directors, her voice slightly weak, but her spirit strong as ever. 20 years ago," she said, "I knocked on Tom's door because I needed help. Today, because of that moment, thousands of people don't have to knock. Help is already there, watching out for them." The Safe Harbor Home program continued to evolve. Stations began offering basic health monitoring training to their mechanics. They developed partnerships with telemedicine providers, turning Safe Harbor stations into remote healthcare access points for rural communities. In Riverside Grove, Tom's old shop had been modified to include a small wellness center. The familiar smell of motor oil now mingled with the scent of coffee from the community room, where seniors gathered daily, ostensibly for social time, but actually for subtle health monitoring. "We're not trying to replace doctors or social workers," Tom explained to a group of visiting healthcare administrators. "We're just filling the gaps, being the eyes and ears on the ground, making sure our neighbors are okay." The program had another unexpected benefit. It helped address the loneliness epidemic in rural communities. Safe Harbor stations became social hubs, places where people could find not just mechanical or medical help, but human connection. Each morning now, across America, Safe Harbor mechanics didn't just check their tools and equipment. They reviewed lists of community members to check on, weather forecasts that might affect vulnerable residents, and schedules of home visits to be made. As the Safe Harbor network approached its 25th anniversary, a new challenge emerged that would test its adaptability once again. Climate change had begun to dramatically reshape rural America, bringing unprecedented weather patterns and natural disasters. But in typical Safe Harbor fashion, the network didn't just respond to these changes, it transformed them into an opportunity to help communities become more resilient. "We're seeing storms that would have been once in a century, events happening every few years now," Tom Wilson explained at an emergency network summit. "We need to do more than just respond to disasters. We need to help our communities prepare for them." This realization led to the creation of Safe Harbor Future, the network's most ambitious initiative yet. Every station would become not just an emergency response center, but a community resilience hub, helping rural towns adapt to a changing climate while maintaining their way of life. Maria Rodriguez, now overseeing the network's southern operations, had already begun implementing these changes in Texas. Her stations had developed innovative water conservation systems and heat emergency protocols that were saving lives during increasingly severe droughts and heat waves. "We're not just fixing cars anymore," she said, showing a group of new trainees around a modernized station. "We're fixing communities' ability to survive and thrive in a changing world." The program started with a comprehensive assessment of each community's vulnerabilities. Safe harbor stations began mapping flood risks, identifying areas prone to wildfires, and cataloging resources that could be critical during extreme weather events. Danny Cooper led the effort to create resilience libraries at each station, collections of tools, equipment, and knowledge that communities might need in various scenarios. These weren't just physical resources, they included detailed plans for everything from evacuation procedures to long-term food security. "The key is making it practical and accessible," Danny explained. "We're taking complex climate science and turning it into actionable steps that any community can understand and implement." In Oregon, Sarah Chen's mountain station had become a model for this new approach. She'd worked with local farmers to develop weather-resistant greenhouses using mechanical knowledge to create simple but effective climate control systems. The station's workshop now included a seed bank and classes on sustainable agriculture alongside traditional automotive repairs. The impact of Safe Harbor Future became clear during a severe weather event in the Midwest. A series of unprecedented storms had threatened to devastate several rural communities, but the preparation and resilience measures put in place by local safe harbor stations helped minimize the damage. "We had everything ready," explained Frank Miller, a station manager. In Iowa, emergency supplies were pre-positioned, evacuation routes were well marked, and every resident knew exactly what to do. When the storms hit, we didn't panic. We activated plans we'd been practicing for months. The success caught the attention of international climate adaptation experts. Representatives from countries around the world began visiting the Safe Harbor Academy to study how a network of local mechanics had created one of the most effective climate resilience programs in rural America. One morning, as Tom was conducting a training session on the new protocols, he received an unexpected message. The United Nations wanted to recognize the Safe Harbor Network with its highest environmental award for community-based climate adaptation. "This isn't just about us," Tom told the gathered media at the award ceremony. "This is about every small town that's refused to be defeated by changing times. We're proving that rural communities don't have to choose between preserving their way of life and adapting to new realities." The Safe Harbor Future program continued to evolve, incorporating new innovations while staying true to its community-based roots. Stations began installing solar panels and battery storage systems, ensuring they could maintain operations during power outages. They developed mobile weather monitoring units that could provide early warnings for severe weather. But perhaps, most importantly, they maintained the human touch that had always been the network's strength. Every technological advance was balanced with community engagement. Every new system was designed to be maintained and operated by local people. In Riverside Grove, Tom's original shop had become a living laboratory for this approach. The old building now sported a green roof that helped manage stormwater runoff, while the parking lot had been redesigned with permeable pavement to prevent flooding. But it was still, at its heart, a place where anyone could walk in and find help. "The technology changes," Tom explained to a group of visiting climate scientists, "but the principle stays the same. We're here to help our neighbors, to keep our communities strong, to make sure no one faces these challenges alone." As climate challenges continued to mount, the Safe Harbor Network's approach proved increasingly valuable. Their combination of technical expertise, community trust, and practical solutions offered a model for how rural communities could adapt without losing their identity. Each station became a hub of local resilience knowledge, collecting and sharing information about what worked in their specific context. They created detailed climate history records, tracking changes in weather patterns and their impacts on local infrastructure. "We're not just preparing for emergencies," Danny Cooper told a new class of trainees. "We're helping our communities evolve, becoming stronger and more resilient while keeping their character intact." 30 years had passed since that stormy night when Safe Harbor began, and Tom Wilson found himself facing a new kind of challenge. The next generation was stepping up to lead the network, bringing fresh perspectives and innovative ideas. But with this transition came an important question. How could Safe Harbor preserve its founding values while embracing necessary change? The answer came from an unexpected source. Lisa Wilson, Tom's granddaughter, had grown up in the shop, learning mechanics alongside community service. Now, at 25, she was proposing something revolutionary, the Safe Harbor Youth Initiative. "Grandpa," she said, spreading blueprints across his old workbench, "we need to connect with young people where they are. The values haven't changed, but how we deliver them has to evolve." The initiative would transform Safe Harbor stations into youth engagement centers, combining traditional mechanical training with modern technology and social consciousness. Lisa had already piloted the program at 3 stations with remarkable results. "We're teaching teenagers to code right alongside changing oil," she explained to the network's board. "They're learning robotics while understanding the importance of human connection. It's not about choosing between old and new, it's about bringing them together." Danny Cooper, now serving as the network's senior advisor, was the first to support the idea. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "We're not just passing on skills, we're passing on values to a new generation." The youth initiative quickly gained momentum. Stations began offering after-school programs that combined technical training with community service. Young people learned mechanical skills while participating in emergency response simulations, climate resilience projects, and community care programs. Maria Rodriguez's stations in Texas became testing grounds for innovative youth engagement. She developed a program where teenagers helped elderly residents navigate new technology while learning traditional mechanical skills from experienced mentors. "It's beautiful to watch," Maria said, observing a group of teens teaching seniors to use emergency alert apps while learning about engine maintenance. The generations aren't just connecting, they're learning from each other. The impact was transformative. Young people who might have dismissed mechanical work as outdated were discovering its enduring value. Meanwhile, veteran mechanics were learning new technologies from their young apprentices. Sarah Chen's mountain station had turned its youth program into a model of environmental stewardship. Teenagers worked on hybrid vehicles while learning about climate change, combining mechanical skills with ecological awareness. "These kids aren't just learning trades," Sarah explained. "They're becoming community leaders who understand both technology and tradition." The program revealed unexpected benefits. In communities with active youth initiative programs, juvenile delinquency rates dropped significantly. Young people found purpose in serving their communities, pride in learning practical skills, and connection in working alongside experienced mentors. One morning, as Tom watched a group of teenagers working in his old shop, he saw something that brought tears to his eyes. A young apprentice had stopped her work to help an elderly customer who seemed confused about his car's new electronic systems. "Let me show you how it works," she said kindly, demonstrating with patience and respect. But also, let me check your oil and tire pressure. Some things never change. The youth initiative expanded to include specialized programs for different interests. There were tracks for environmental technology, emergency medical response, community organization and traditional mechanics, all united by Safe Harbor's core values of service and compassion. Lisa's vision went beyond just teaching skills. She created leadership development programs, ensuring that the next generation of Safe Harbor leaders would emerge from within the communities they served. We're not just training mechanics or technicians, she explained at a network conference. We're developing community guardians who understand both the technical and human aspects of what we do. The program's success attracted attention from educational institutions. Universities began offering college credits for Safe Harbor youth programs, recognizing their unique combination of technical training and community service. In Riverside Grove, Tom's original shop had been expanded to include a youth center, complete with both traditional tools and modern technology. But the heart of the space remained the same. A place where anyone could come for help, where community service was valued above all. The tools change, Tom told a group of young apprentices, but the purpose remains constant. We're here to help people, to strengthen communities, to make sure no one faces life's challenges alone. The youth initiative proved that Safe Harbor's values could not only survive, but thrive in a new era. Young people brought energy and innovation, while seasoned mechanics provided wisdom and experience. Together, they were creating something powerful, a bridge between generations, between tradition and progress. As Safe Harbor approached its 35th year, a monumental shift in transportation technology threatened to make traditional mechanical skills obsolete. The rapid adoption of autonomous vehicles and electric cars had many wondering if the network's foundation of grassroots mechanical expertise was still relevant. But once again, Safe Harbor found a way to turn challenge into opportunity. Change isn't our enemy, Lisa Wilson declared at an emergency network summit. It's our chance to prove that human connection matters more than ever in an automated world. From this philosophy emerged Safe Harbor Connect, a bold initiative that would bridge the gap between traditional mechanical knowledge and emerging technologies while keeping community service at its heart. Tom Wilson, now in his 70s, but still sharp as ever, watched with pride as his granddaughter laid out the vision. Safe Harbor stations would become smart community hubs, places where high-tech solutions met hometown values. We're not giving up our wrenches, Lisa explained to concerned veteran mechanics. We're adding new tools to our toolkit. When an autonomous vehicle breaks down in a snowstorm, people still need a safe harbor. The transformation began at Tom's original shop in Riverside Grove. Traditional repair bays were upgraded with diagnostic systems for electric and autonomous vehicles, but the old tools remained, hanging proudly on the walls. More importantly, the shop maintained its role as a community gathering place. Danny Cooper, though officially retired, became instrumental in developing training programs that combined old-school mechanical wisdom with new technology. The principles haven't changed, he would tell trainees. Whether it's a carburetor or a computer, our job is still about helping people get home safely. Maria Rodriguez's Texas stations pioneered a unique approach to the transition. They created tech translation teams, groups of mechanics who specialized in explaining complex vehicle technology to older community members while maintaining traditional repair skills for classic cars. The impact of Safe Harbor Connect became evident during a massive software glitch that affected autonomous vehicles across 3 states. While other service providers were overwhelmed, Safe Harbor stations smoothly handled the crisis, providing both technical solutions and human comfort to stranded travelers. This is why we never abandoned our roots, Lisa told a news crew covering the event. Technology can fail, but community never does. Our mechanics understand both the code and the human element. Sarah Chen's mountain station had become a testing ground for hybrid solutions. They developed innovative ways to combine electric vehicle charging with traditional emergency services, ensuring that no one would be stranded in remote areas, regardless of their vehicle type. The program revealed unexpected benefits. Elderly, community members who had been hesitant about new vehicle technology found comfort in learning from trusted safe harbor mechanics. Young tech enthusiasts discovered the value of hands-on mechanical skills. The stations became bridges, not just between technologies, but between generations. One morning, as Tom supervised a training session, he witnessed a scene that embodied everything Safe Harbor Connect stood for. A young mechanic was helping an elderly man understand his new electric car's systems, while simultaneously teaching a teenager how to change a tire on a classic automobile. "See," Tom said to a visiting journalist, "technology changes, but people's need for help and human connection remains constant." The initiative expanded to include specialized programs for different aspects of modern transportation. Safe harbor stations began offering certification courses in electric vehicle maintenance, autonomous system diagnostics, and traditional mechanical repairs, all united by the network's core values of service and community care. Lisa's vision went beyond just adapting to new technology. She created programs that used artificial intelligence to enhance, rather than replace, human judgment in emergency response. Safe harbor stations began using predictive analytics to anticipate where help might be needed, while maintaining the personal touch that had always been their trademark. "We're not fighting the future," she explained at a transportation technology conference. "We're ensuring that it serves human needs and community values." In Riverside Grove, Tom's original shop had evolved into a model for this balanced approach. The building now featured solar charging stations and advanced diagnostic equipment alongside traditional repair tools. But most importantly, it remained a place where anyone could walk in and find not just technical help, but human understanding. The Safe Harbor Network was proving that the principles of community service and human connection weren't obsolete in the digital age. They were more important than ever. As technology made the world more connected, but potentially more impersonal, Safe Harbor stations became vital anchors of human interaction and community support. As Safe Harbor approached its 40th year, the network faced its most personal challenge yet. Tom Wilson, the man who had started it all on that stormy night, suffered a serious heart attack. As he recovered in the hospital, the entire network grappled with a profound realization. Even the strongest foundations needed to be preserved and protected for future generations. "We need to make sure Dad's legacy lives on," Lisa Wilson addressed. An emergency gathering of network leaders, not just in buildings or programs, but in the spirit of what he created. This catalyst moment gave birth to Safe Harbor Legacy, an initiative designed to document, preserve, and transmit the core values and wisdom that had made the network successful for 4 decades. From his hospital bed, Tom began recording stories, not just of that first night with Maggie Sullivan, but of countless small moments that had shaped the network's soul. Each story captured a lesson, a value, or a principle that had guided Safe Harbor's growth. "It's not about me," Tom insisted, his voice weaker but his spirit strong as ever. "It's about making sure the heart of what we do never gets lost in the midst of progress." Danny Cooper, Maria Rodriguez, and other veteran leaders joined the effort, sharing their own experiences and insights. They created what became known as the Safe Harbor Wisdom Library, a living archive of practical knowledge and human understanding. The Legacy Initiative took shape in multiple forms. Each station began maintaining a story wall where significant moments of community service were documented. These weren't just tales of dramatic rescues, but of small acts of kindness that had made lasting impacts. Sarah Chen's Mountain Station developed an innovative approach to preserving practical knowledge. They created detailed records of not just how to fix things, but how to read situations, how to understand when people needed more than just technical help. Technical skills can be taught from manuals, Sarah explained to new trainees. But knowing how to read the worry in a parent's eyes when their car breaks down with a sick child in the back seat, that kind of wisdom has to be passed down person to person. The impact of Safe Harbor Legacy became evident during a major crisis. When a devastating hurricane hit the Gulf Coast, new station leaders found themselves drawing on the documented experiences of their predecessors, applying decades-old wisdom to modern challenges. These aren't just stories, Lisa told a group, of emergency responders studying the network's methods. They're roadmaps for how to maintain humanity in times of crisis. In Riverside Grove, Tom's original shop became a living museum of sorts, though it remained an active station. Tools and photographs lined the walls, each with a story attached, each teaching a lesson about community service and human connection. One morning, as Tom was finally well enough to visit his shop again, he watched a young mechanic explain to a stranded traveler not just what was wrong with their electric car, but why they shouldn't drive through the coming storm. "That's it," Tom said softly to Lisa. "That's what we need to preserve. Not just the knowledge of how to fix things, but the wisdom to know when people need more than just repairs." The Legacy Initiative expanded to include regular wisdom sharing sessions where veteran mechanics shared their experiences with newer members of the network. These weren't just technical training sessions, they were lessons in human understanding and community care. Each station began maintaining detailed records of their community's needs, challenges, and resources. But these weren't just statistical databases. They were rich with personal stories and insights that helped new station operators understand the human dimension of their work. "We're not just archiving the past," Lisa explained at a network conference. "We're providing future generations with the tools they need to maintain the human touch in an increasingly technological world." As Tom recovered, he spent more time at the academy, sharing his experiences with new trainees. His stories weren't just about mechanical problems solved or emergencies handled. They were about the moments of human connection that had made it all meaningful. The 45th anniversary of Safe Harbor brought an unexpected opportunity that would test everything the network had learned over nearly half a century. A major technology company approached the network with an offer. They wanted to integrate Safe Harbor's community-based approach into their global emergency response system. Lisa Wilson found herself standing in a sleek corporate boardroom in Silicon Valley, far from the familiar comfort of her grandfather's shop. "What you're offering is impressive," she told the executives. "But Safe Harbor isn't just a system or a method, it's a way of life." This moment sparked the creation of Safe Harbor Global, not just an expansion, but a mission to prove that their grassroots, community-centered approach could work anywhere in the world. Tom Wilson, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever, watched from his favorite chair in the original shop as the initiative took shape. "The world's gotten smaller," he observed, "but people's needs haven't changed. Everyone needs a safe harbor sometimes." The challenge was immense: how to scale a system built on personal connections and local knowledge to a global level without losing its soul. The answer came from an unexpected source: the network's youngest members. "We don't need to make every station identical," explained Mike Chen, Sarah's son and a third-generation Safe Harbor mechanic. "We need to help each community create its own version of safe harbor based on their unique needs and culture. The network began sending teams of veteran mechanics and young innovators to different countries, not to establish traditional safe harbor stations, but to help local communities adapt the network's principles to their own contexts. In rural India, they helped local mechanics transform their shops into community centers that combined vehicle repair with monsoon preparation. In the Australian outback, they worked with Aboriginal communities to integrate traditional knowledge with modern emergency response techniques. Maria Rodriguez led the Latin American initiative, helping communities from Mexico to Argentina develop their own versions of safe harbor stations. Each community has its own challenges, she explained, but the basic principle remains the same: people helping people. The impact was profound. Communities that had struggled with emergency response began developing their own unique solutions, inspired by Safe Harbor's approach, but rooted in their local culture and needs. Danny Cooper, though officially retired, became the network's global wisdom keeper, traveling to help new stations understand the core values that had made Safe Harbor successful. The technology and methods might be different, he would tell them, but the heart of what we do never changes. One morning, as Tom reviewed photos from new stations around the world, he saw something that brought tears to his eyes. In a small village in Kenya, a local mechanic had painted the Safe Harbor motto on his shop wall in Swahili, but underneath it was the English translation: "Because no one should face the storm alone." The global initiative revealed unexpected benefits. Different communities began sharing their unique solutions and approaches, creating a worldwide network of local wisdom. A flood prevention technique developed in Bangladesh was adapted for use in Louisiana. A community outreach program from New Zealand was modified to work in Norway. Lisa found herself coordinating this growing global network from a new international headquarters built right next to Tom's original shop in Riverside Grove. "We're not just exporting a system," she explained to visiting international delegates. "We're sharing a vision of what communities can be when people come together to help each other." The technology company's involvement proved valuable, but not in the way they had initially proposed. Instead of standardizing Safe Harbor's approach, they developed tools to help different communities share their knowledge and experiences while maintaining their unique identities. "Technology should connect communities, not replace them," Lisa told a global conference on emergency response. "That's what Safe Harbor has always been about, using whatever tools we have to help people help each other." In Riverside Grove, Tom's original shop remained unchanged amid all this global expansion. It served as a reminder that no matter how far the network reached, its strength came from its local roots and personal connections. 50 years had passed since that stormy night when Tom Wilson opened his shop door to help Maggie Sullivan. On a crisp autumn morning, thousands gathered in Riverside Grove to celebrate not just a half-century of Safe Harbor, but a legacy that had transformed millions of lives around the world. Tom Wilson, now in his 90s, sat in his favorite chair, outside his original shop, watching as people from every corner of the globe came to pay tribute. The small town had become a pilgrimage site for those who believed in the power of community and kindness. "I never imagined all this," he said softly to Lisa, who hadn't left his side during the celebrations. "I just opened the door that night because someone needed help." The celebration wasn't just about looking back, it was about looking forward. Lisa unveiled Safe Harbor Next, a vision for the network's next 50 years. The initiative would combine everything they'd learned about community, technology, and human connection to prepare for future challenges. What made the moment especially Poignant was the presence of 3 generations of safe harbor leaders. Tom, the founder who had started it all with one simple act of kindness. Lisa, who had helped the network evolve and grow globally. And now, young mechanics from around the world who were carrying the vision forward in ways no one could have imagined. Maria Rodriguez's granddaughter, Carmen, presented findings from safe harbor stations in 30 countries. Every culture is different, she explained, but the need for community, for help in times of trouble, for human connection, that's universal. Danny Cooper's great-nephew James demonstrated how new stations in Africa were combining traditional wisdom with advanced technology to create early warning systems for communities facing climate challenges. Sarah Chen's children had established a network of mountain stations across Asia, adapting safe harbors principles to help remote communities maintain their independence while staying connected to vital resources. The day was filled with stories, thousands of them, each representing a life touched, a community strengthened, a moment when someone found help when they needed it most. But perhaps the most moving moment came when an elderly woman approached. "Tom, you don't remember me," she said, her eyes bright with emotion. "But 30 years ago, your station helped me when my car broke down. I was pregnant, scared, and alone. The mechanic didn't just fix my car, he made sure I had a safe place to stay until the storm passed. That baby is now running a safe harbor station in Australia." Tom's original shop had been preserved exactly as it was that first night, though now it was part of a larger complex that included the Global Response Center and the Safe Harbor Academy. But it wasn't kept as a museum. It remained a working station, still helping travelers, still keeping its light on through dark nights. Lisa's Safe Harbor Next initiative laid out a bold vision. Every station would become a hub for community, resilience, combining emergency response with long-term preparation for future challenges. They would use advanced technology while maintaining the human touch that had always been their strength. "We're not just planning for the next crisis," Lisa explained to the gathered crowd. "We're building communities that can face any challenge because they face it together." The network had proven that the simplest ideas were often the most powerful. That in a world of increasing complexity, the basic principle of helping others remained constant. That no matter how much technology advanced, people would always need other people. As the sun set on the celebration, Tom sat in his shop one last time, running his hand along the worn workbench where it all began. "You know what I'm most proud of?" he said to Lisa. "Not the buildings, not the programs, not even the lives saved, though those matter. I'm most proud that we never lost sight of why we started. We kept it simple, help people, be there when they need you, keep the light on in the darkness." The Safe Harbor Network had become more than just an emergency response system. It was a testament to the enduring power of human kindness, a proof that one person's choice to help another could spark a movement that would transform the world. Because sometimes the greatest legacies aren't built in grand gestures or revolutionary innovations. Sometimes they're built in simple moments of kindness, in choices to help others, in decisions to keep a light on through the storm. The story of Safe Harbor wasn't just about one man, one night, or one act of kindness. It was about the endless ripples that spread from that moment, touching lives across generations and continents. It was about proving that in a world that often seemed divided and disconnected, the simple act of helping others could still build bridges, strengthen communities, and change lives. As Tom Wilson looked out at the gathering darkness, he saw the shop's light reflect in the window, just as it had that stormy night 50 years ago. And he knew that as long as there were people willing to help others, as long as there were lights burning in the darkness, there would always be safe harbors for those in need.